Welcome to Charts Today. My name is David Linton, and today's edition for Wednesday, the 28th of November, comes to you from London. And we're here for the European opening. We've just opened just over half an hour ago. And first of all, the dollar is just pushing ahead still, just moving to clear long-term bullish on the Ichimoku chart on the weekly. Remembering this is my long-term, my medium-term, and my short-term chart. So we're seeing dollar strength. Euro weakness on that dollar strength, so euro sinking lower, taking out yesterday's low, and the November low looking like it will come under pressure. If we do see new lows on the euro, that will mark activate a target to 107, and we've already got this target of 95 cents. So the market is still fearful of further big downside targets there. Against the yen, the dollar is pushing higher, bullish on all three time frames, and this is normally a good lead indicator for the dollar. Looking at sterling, we're seeing sterling pushing lower this morning at 127. Brexit woes still weighing heavily there, and against the euro is fairly flat, so Brexit affecting both currencies really. The Swiss franc, we're seeing sterling is weak here as well, and against the Aussie dollar weaker as well. Bitcoin is up 5%, but that's of little consolation given the recent falls that we've seen. But we're sitting at $3,900, just nudging that $4,000, what was support now becoming resistance. And so Bitcoin's still looking pretty worrying. We've got some fairly big downside targets still hanging over us. US markets were fairly flat last night. We saw a slight improvement in the S&P 500, still bearish on the medium and short-term charts. The Nasdaq also still bearish on the medium and short-term charts. We do have this downside target of around 10% long-term activated and 18% if we see new lows. So new lows would certainly be very bad for the Nasdaq from here. The Dow also bearish on both time frames with downside targets here of 3 and 7% and longer term 10 and 14%. So noticing that we have got upside and downside targets, the market could go either way, but at the moment we're looking bearish on those short and medium term charts. And the Russell 2000 was down yesterday, more heavily down, just under 1%. Futures this morning, the S&P future is up 0.14%, and the Nasdaq E-mini is up 0.17% with slight upside targets. So it does look like we might just see a slight recovery there. Looking at the UK market, we see the FTSE index is just recovering to short-term bullish, so that's bucking the trend there. It's not quite yet there. And looking at the mid caps, we're also seeing much the same transition, not yet quite bullish. So looking better in the UK, and looking at the DAX, also just pushing through on that as well. But these markets fairly sedate this morning. The CAC Current up 0.15%. Tokyo was up 0.6% on the 400 index and starting to look a little bit better, but still bearish medium and long term. And the Hang Seng was up 1.3%, maybe just finding some support here on the cloud on that long-term chart. The short-term chart actually looking pretty bullish now. And the Chinese market up over 1%, but again, still bearish on all three time frames and still our main concern. The Sensex in India up 0.7%, and the Aussie market fairly flat, down slightly overnight. Brent crude, looking at commodities now, Brent crude up over 1% this morning. Still not quite bullish on that short-term chart. We do have upside targets here of 4% and 6%, so that is looking a little bit better. We definitely do not want to see new lows on Brent crude, otherwise we will activate very big downside targets there. And the same for WTI. And we have actually activated on the medium term 0.5% chart a downside target all the way down to about $30. So that is still quite scary, but we are seeing new upside targets on the short term chart, so we may be hitting a low point. Nat gas sitting at $4.19, so sitting fairly steady there. And if we look at gold falling on that stronger dollar this morning, so sitting at $1,213. Short-term bearish. Silver also short-term bearish on the stronger dollar. US 10-year yields sitting steady at 3.06%. Might be just turning into a bullish territory there. And German bond prices up this morning, so weaker yields, stronger bonds. Last night, we saw continued falls in Apple. This is still a major concern for the market, being the biggest stock. Microsoft set to outstrip Apple in terms of market cap if we keep seeing this fall. Amazon also still bearish on the short term, as is Google and Facebook looking terrible on all three time frames. So Facebook still very worrying with big downside targets still some 20% away. Taking a look at the markets themselves, this data coming to you from Yahoo Finance. So we see the world indices here, mostly green. So that just tells us that we're seeing improvement across the markets. The big rises actually were in Asia. We're not seeing that yet in Europe, and it's fairly muted on the US futures, but we are seeing a general improvement today. Looking at overnight, we talked about the situation in on the Nasdaq. Seeing these stocks lower is really a concern. Taking just a quick look at some of the others, Microsoft actually was up 0.63%, so they're looking a little bit better. Nvidia, which has had a terrible time lately, actually recovering a little bit there as well. And Tesla were down 0.6%, and Netflix actually were up 2%. So seeing quite a variation in performances there. On the Aussie market, we've got some strong performances with Oho Media up 6%, so quite a big rise there, but really just maybe bouncing on that long-term support, still medium-term bearish, and has really done very little against the Dow Jones index. This is the relative chart, remember. Taking a look at the downside, there's still some big falls here. Saracen Mineral Holdings down 7%, Ausdrill down 5%, so we are seeing still some pretty big falls. China was a sea of green, so that's pretty bullish. Only a couple of stocks down. Hong Kong similar, most of the stocks up, and we saw here some stocks rising as much as 3 or 4%. And on the Nifty 50, we were pretty evenly split. Infosys up 4%, Tata Consultancy up nearly 4%, and on the downside, we had Yes Bank, who've had a terrible time of lately, down 9%. So making new lows on Yes Bank, that's very bearish for the chart. We've got a downside target here, some 40% lower, and long-term targets even worse. So not looking great there. Looking at the Nikkei 225, we see again we had Sumitomo up 18%, so a really big move there. This chart looks absolutely fantastic, bucking the trend against most other charts. But on the other side, we did have some big falls. Family Mart down 7%. Taking a look at Europe now, and here we see the FTSE 100 prices all coming in from Yahoo Finance, and if we click just to see the best performers, Glencore up 1.5%, Centrica recovering a little bit after their big falls last week, up 1.5%, Sage, who've had a terrible time of late, up 1.3%, starting to turn a bit of a corner there, Sage. They might be just looking a little bit better, and on the relative chart starting to break the trend as well. And then taking a look at the downside for the FTSE 100 index. At the other end of the scale, we've got BHP. So it's not all minerals up. Glencore and BHP performing very differently. Royal Mail still down a further 1.5%, looking terrible on the chart. Looking at the FTSE 250, again just ranking by performance. On the Beach Group up 4%, UDG Healthcare up 3.8%. And if we go to the other end of the scale, Thomas Cook, they were down some 20% yesterday, just falling even lower and looking just terrible on that chart. Gone from 150 earlier this year to 35 pence, so it's really just falling away big time there. Shaftesbury had their results out yesterday. They were quite strong results, but we are seeing the shares still underperforming the market, and we've got downside targets, so the market just starting to digest that. Looking at the Euro Stock 600, we see here we have Atlas Europe up 3.8%, so looking pretty strong there. On the other end of the scale, Tenaris down 8%, that's in Italy, and looking pretty grim there. And in continental, we're seeing in Germany also looking lower as well. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.